Well, I'm joined now by NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans, and Daniel Desrochers, international trade reporter for Politico. Thanks to all of you for starting us off on this big day for the economy. Yamiche, let's start with you. So Ontario says it's going to stop running the ad. What could the implications of that be? Could President Trump restart talks? Is that enough?
Well, Kristen, I can tell you that is a key question. As soon as this news came out that Doug Ford was pulling down this ad, he said starting Monday, I went out to the White House to ask that very question. I have not gotten a response, but I can tell you as someone, of course, who has covered Trump a long time alongside you, Kristen, that the president is someone who does react in the moment. So if he was angry about this ad and stopped the trade negotiations because of it, he might also be as reactive when now you're having Canada essentially say, okay, we're going to put down this ad, which, by the way, as you pointed out, did edit and cherry pick part of this speech. It left out some key parts. But the point is that the president, I think, is seen as someone who is malleable on the trade talk. So we'll have to see if the White House gets back to me. I'll keep looking at my phone to see if I get an answer, Kristen.
Do you have a sense, Yamiche, of just how dug in he is on this specific issue? How enraged was he?
It was clear that the president was very bothered by this, especially because the ad was using Ronald Reagan, someone that the president has talked about, someone who the president sees as a stalwart of the Republican Party. So I know that the president was clearly angry about this, and the fact that he cut off trade negotiations. I mean, he's talked about threatening to cut off trade negotiations with a number of countries. But let's remember, Canada, our northern neighbor, it is a country that we do a large amount of trade with. Also, Prime Minister Carney was in the Oval Office not that long ago, and the president had a very warm relationship with him, saying that he had made him famous because, of course, part of Carney's election pitch was that he was going to push back on President Trump trying to make Canada the 51st state, a number of other threats that he was making to Canada at the time of the election. So it seems that the president was very bothered by this. Whether or not this means that he's going to sort of hold off on trade negotiations in the long term, I think is the big question that I'm still trying to get an answer to from the White House.
Well, Yamiche, of course, trade is front and center as President Trump prepares to head to Asia for a 5-day trip to the region. It will include, the White House confirms, a meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. Secretary Scott Bessent signaling he's optimistic a deal can be struck. What are the expectations that you are hearing from your sources there?
Well, I can tell you that the White House just held a sort of briefing for reporters about this trip to Asia. I want to read to you part of what a U.S. official said on the call about this meeting between China and, of course, the President Xi Jinping and President Trump. The person said that President Trump is most interested in discussing trade and the economic relationship between the United States and China, and that will definitely be the focus of the President Trump's discussions, especially, this official said, given that some of the actions that China has announced in the last couple of weeks really threatens global economic stability. So President Trump is going there laser focused on trying to figure out a trade negotiation with China, seeing as he believes that their most recent actions are really adversarial, Kristen.
All right, Yamiche Alcindor starting us off at the White House. Yamiche, thank you so much for your reporting. We really appreciate it. Christine Romans, let me head over to you. Put this moment into context. The fact that President Trump issued that overnight announcement on social media that he's suspending trade negotiations with Canada, just what are the implications?
You know, look, this is one of America's biggest trading partners. It's one of the biggest sources of imports to the United States, and it's a neighbor and an ally, long ally, cousins, really. These countries have often kind of considered themselves. And now you have a really tense moment here. You know, the president has cut off these trade negotiations before, only to come back to the table. And I think Yamiche is exactly right. He can be very reactionary when things aren't going his way. He was very angry about milk and dairy trading issues earlier this summer when they were talking and cut off trade negotiations, only to come back to the table again. So a lot of work still to do on this relationship. We'll see if he comes back and they get things moving ahead. But it's an incredibly important trading relationship. They've got to work it out.
Yeah. What are the implications for the U.S. economy if they can't work it out in the near term, Christine?
I mean, for U.S. small manufacturers, for U.S. businesses that rely on imports and commodities from Canada, I mean, it could be existential for some of those companies. You know, if you start to see really high tariffs or an inability to get stuff, and that ultimately could mean to lead to higher prices for consumers. But I will say, my sources in the White House are very quick to point out that inflation at 3%, while higher than policymakers would like, you haven't seen the worst case scenario that so many economists had forecast about tariffs, showing up into higher prices already.
Well, you take me to my next question, because we did get the September inflation numbers. They ticked up just a bit, not as much as economists were bracing for, though. Are we still expecting the Fed to cut interest rates? And what does this say about the overall picture for the economy?
Yeah, you've got stubborn inflation, but Wall Street really cheering here today because it is, quite frankly, intoxicated by trillions of dollars of AI spending. That's been helping the market, and really looking forward to lower rates next week when the Fed meets, and maybe lower another tick lower in rates later this year. So that low rates and that AI spending has been very, very good for the stock market. Even as people at home, I think Main Street and Wall Street having kind of two different experiences here. 3% inflation is still higher than most people would like. Food inflation is still ticking up. And you look at things like beef, record high beef prices, shelter prices. That's, what you pay to live in your house or rent your house. Those are still rising, although a little more slowly. And we saw energy prices tick up a little bit. We'll be watching that closely as well, because gas prices have been a good point for the American pocketbook, but we have seen oil prices tick up this week because of new sanctions against those two big Russian oil giants. So you can see on your screen there, I mean, look at coffee prices up over the past year.
Wow.
People, Main Street, people who go out and have to buy groceries and have to pay for electricity and have to pay for car insurance, they're not feeling exactly what you're seeing on Wall Street right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those numbers you see there really tells the tale of some of the price increases consumers are experiencing. Christine Romans, thank you so much. Daniel, let me turn to you now. Let's talk about the status of talks with Canada before President Trump suspended everything. What were the key sticking points? Where did things stand 24 hours ago?
Yeah, there's really been a kind of, on again, off again relationship with these trade talks. The president of the administration, they've exempted most of the products that we import from Canada from tariffs if they comply with the free trade agreement that he signed back in his first term. You don't have tariffs on them. And so that's given them a little more wiggle room than they've had with, say, the European Union or Japan or China. And so, we had the visit from Prime Minister Carney a couple weeks ago, and it seemed like talks had really picked up again. He was projecting a lot of optimism. He seemed like he felt like there was some forward momentum for loosening up some of these things. The sticking points, there are some major ones, and they tend to be the sector-specific tariffs that the administration has put on. So the steel and aluminum sector in Canada is really hurting because they aren't able, they're tariffed on their imports to the U.S. The lumber sector, which is now about to face higher tariffs, is also up in arms. And so you're seeing those very specific industries that are starting to push back.
Well, I guess it's notable that Canada, Ontario, came out so quickly, pulled the ad down. The question that Yamiche and I were discussing, could this prompt President Trump to actually reverse course? So we'll watch and wait to see what happens in that regard. But what does it say about how Canada is viewing this moment and the leverage that it may or may not have?
Well, yeah, and this is actually not the first time that Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, has kind of gotten himself into these trade talks. Early on, he had threatened to cut off electricity to the U.S. from Ontario, which it's kind of interdependent relationship. That set the administration off. The president was really mad at him. And now it seems like he's kind of stepped in it again. I think you saw a lot of this elbows up. Canada's not going to succumb to what the United States is demanding early on. And as Prime Minister Carney has taken office, the tone has really shifted. And he's been trying to kind of work with the president, try and foster a more, I guess, gentle relationship as he tries to back him off some of these hardline positions. And so I think the ad just kind of aggravated those tensions that have still been lingering and were already there early on in this relationship.
Well, in just a few hours, President Trump is going to depart for Asia for a 5-day high-stakes trip. He'll be meeting with President Xi Jinping. I know you're gearing up for a busy week yourself. What are the key things you'll be watching for? Obviously, the meeting with President Xi at the top of the list.
Yeah, that one's huge, particularly as the administration's really been seeing pushback from farmers, particularly soy farmers.
Yeah.
China cut off its purchases of soybeans back in May. And so soybean farmers who are already facing higher inputs for fertilizer and equipment are really struggling right now. And the president he's feeling pressure to deliver on some sort of new market for the soybean farmers, particularly as the shutdown has made it harder for Congress to step in and provide relief. But then you also have some of these lingering lingering trade deals that we had already crafted, and there are more details to be done. And South Korea is a really, really big one there. There was a pledge of $350 billion in investments that they were going to make in the U.S., and they're kind of wrangling over exactly how that investment process will work. Japan had already agreed to do $550 billion in investments and gave the U.S. a lot of control over that. And South Korea doesn't necessarily want to follow the same format. And so you have a new Japanese prime minister. She might push back on what already happened. And those are really big stakes for the president.
It will be fascinating to see the interplay with the new Japanese prime minister. Daniel Desrochers, thank you so much for your great reporting and analysis. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.